is the last part of our first section, which is design, and we are going to have Duretti speak. Duretti is a back-end engineer at Slack, and I've seen her talk before, and she's awesome. She talks a lot about things that a lot of API conferences miss. So a lot of API conferences talk a lot about technology, stuff like that. We will as well. What I love about Duretti is how she thinks very similar to kind of the way I think, which is doesn't really matter what the tech is, as long as someone can use it, as long as you have empathy and everything. So I won't spoil too much of her talk, but here we go.
All right. What up, everybody? Okay, hi. The title of my talk is Good APIs Make for Good UIs. Hello, I'm Duretti. My handle is my first name, so shout out to my parents for the excellent SEO. It's lovely being in the first name club. Except for on Snapchat, there's like some teen in North Carolina who has that, so don't add me on Snapchat. Senior engineer on the growth team at Slack. What does that mean? Growth team does anything from when you sign up to Slack to your first 5 minutes in Slack to maybe when you want to pay for Slack, just inflection points in the product. We also maintain Slackbot, so you're welcome, but also sorry. And I've also worked on a platform team which does a lot of API infrastructure. What is Slack? Have you heard of Slack? It is an application for teams, for you to talk to your coworkers and maybe share memes. I don't know what you might be working with it. I've been at Slack for over 2 years now, and it's been great. Here's some things about us. 5 million people every day use this app. It's wild. And we've convinced 1.5 million of them to pay us, and there are 800 people that work at Slack worldwide. And today we're going to talk about APIs. And for the purpose of this talk, when I say API, I'm thinking of it through the lens of a product company. And when I say product company, I mean a software company that does a lot of stuff on the internet. And you might be thinking, girl, what you know about APIs, though? I'm going to tell you. I was a front-end dev for many years, like 7 years, and so I was a consumer of APIs, and therefore I developed some hashtag opinions about them. And now I'm a back-end dev, and I've written APIs at Slack and also maintained the API infrastructure, as I mentioned. So what are we going to talk about? Okay, we're going to talk about a brief history lesson of APIs, which might sound familiar because we've had some really great speakers today. This really nebulous interface is an interface tautology that will make more sense later. And then what it means to have a good developer experience. All right, history lesson. So APIs have been around for a while, and it stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's just the way that you interact in a codified manner with other people's code. They've been called libraries in the past. So cast your mind back, way back to the 90s. We're going to talk about what was an API then. It was SOAP. So we talked about SOAP a little bit today, but it stands for Simple Object Access Protocol, and it's the dominant API design style at the time. And it came out of Microsoft in the 90s, so it's a little needlessly complicated. And it's also a spec. So when it's a spec, there's much more rigid rules about how it needs to be implemented. SOAP requests come in envelopes, which is an optional header and a body. But I like to think of it as a pizza, right? You have your envelope, which is cool and crust, body, with cheese on it, optional headers, basil, minimum viable pizza. Look at this, SOAP request. I encourage you to think of it that way as well. So what's good about SOAP requests? It's well structured. You understand what's going to come back in terms of the responses and the requests, and there's more security because the transport layer is not HTTP, right? So it's transport agnostic. What are some of the cons? What could be the cons of SOAP? Oh, it's this. This is this is like a sample XML, header and body and stuff. And what does this mean? I don't know. So the cons is that XML is really verbose and it's very heavyweight. And anyone that's tried to parse XML in JavaScript knows what it's like to want to blind yourself. Okay, so too opinionated. SOAP is too opinionated. So what do? REST comes along. Roy Fielding comes up with Rust in 2000 as a part of his dissertation out of UC Irvine. And I don't know what you were doing in 2000, but I was not doing anything nearly as useful as this. So the cool thing about Rust is, it leverages HTTP verbs, get, post, put, delete, all those good things. And it also uses URLs, which is like the currency of the web, right? This is super neat. So let's imagine we are making an API. I only have two interests in life, which are snacks and computers. So we can imagine, cool things here. Yeah, it's not a spec. What's happening? Okay. So because it's not a spec, we can let the browsers deal with some of the more interesting transport issues. What's cool about it is it's flexible, it's portable, it's easy to modify, and so Rust is easier in that way because it's not as opinionated. But some of the cons are security and latency, because you can just sort of like sniff in a network inspector like what APIs and what information is coming over the wire, and also latency because it depends on the network, right? However, the cognitive load of Rust being so much easier to reason about is it's just so much lower that it's a trade that we decide to make as an industry. Also, JSON comes about at this time. JSON is becoming more of a thing. Douglas Crockford is, at Yahoo, popularizing this format. And because JSON is JavaScript, it's much easier to parse from the front end. So we take this thing from before, and now it's this. Literally, that's wild. That's wild. So it's the same XML boiled down, and it's much more readable. And this is, I think, what makes Rust the dominant architectural design. Also, at this point, we start to see kind of the rise of social networks, Flickr, Twitter, Facebook, and we start to want to have increased interconnectivity between our sites. So, this is, I think, pretty common. Someone has a blog and they want to embed their Twitter feed into it. And so I think this kind of drives the adoption of Rust, or Google Maps or things like that. So it becomes massively useful. All right, cool. History lesson over. All right, interface is an interface. That doesn't make any sense, but I will hopefully make that more clear. Why do I keep saying interface? I think interface is more than how something is presented. Typically in computering, an interface is thought of the edge or the boundary between where two components meet. So you have your front end and your API layer, and then maybe your back end. And what is important for an interface to do? The first job of an interface is to communicate clearly. That's job number one. Also, it's important for an interface to be well organized. It needs to be modular, it needs to be well designed, and well-designed code kind of reduces cognitive load, much like a well-designed interface, like a front-end interface might be. Also, it's intuitive to use. Good design is like 99% invisible and also intuitive and easily navigatable. This is easier said than done, so but we're building software so we can iterate. So at the end of the day, I think good interfaces are empathetic because they take your needs into consideration. They try to feel your pain points and address them, and they try to put yourself, people who design good interfaces put themselves in your shoes to kind of give a good experience. So this is some shameless promotion. I really care about empathy in the development process. If you want to find me later to talk about how we can be kinder and decent to each other, I want to talk to you about that forever. Okay. So yes, good interfaces are universal. Realistically, there's no difference between an interface you click around versus what's returned programmatically in an API. A good interface has just some very specific qualities, and that they do take your needs into consideration. Okay, cool. So that's what I mean by an interface is an interface. So now that we know a little bit about what an interface is, let's talk about API, the history of API design. Now that we've talked about history of API design and what an interface is, let's talk about what makes for an easy breezy developer experience. So UX is to UI as I think DX, which is a fake term I made up, developer experience is to API. User experience is the overall experience of using a user interface, and the developer experience is the overall experience of using an API. And in both cases, we're interested in how easy or pleasing it is to use these interfaces. So the hallmark of a good user experience is that it's consistent, that things behave in the way that you expect them to. People spend a certain amount of cognitive, juice learning how to get around your interface. And so if you can anticipate the actions that people are going to take, it really delights them because they feel like, oh, like this person thought about what I might be doing. Like, this is great. It's really great to kind of be surprised by thoughtfulness. So how many of you all have heard of Seamless? No? Yes? Okay. So Seamless and Grubhub merged in like 2013, and they somewhat recently, released a refreshed UI because they had merged their backends. And the response to that refresh was very strong because people had spent, a certain amount of cognitive, stuff to figure out how to use the mobile app or whatever and get around as quickly as possible. And it was like a total who moved my cheese scenario because they had gotten used to how to get around there. And it worked for them despite, the perceived pain points. I think so much in software we think like, how can we make this better? How can we iterate? How can we make this better? But sometimes people have just learned what they're going to learn about our interfaces, so we need to take that into consideration. So this is the developer version of that last tweet. It's a Medium post because we are very verbose as a group. And this is a post by Matthew Rothenberg. He built this project, Emoji Tracker, and it's a real-time visualization of every emoji on Twitter. And it just sort of streams live events and updates the emoji count. This is just a screenshot. If you look at it, there's actually an epilepsy warning because it goes quite quick. But you can click an emoji and see kind of what tweet has used it recently. Peace hand is my favorite emoji. And so if you click on it, you can see that. And you can see tweets attached to it. And so it's a really cool side project. It's a great use of an API. So why is Matthew mad? Why is he writing a long piece about this? Twitter is removing his access to the streaming API, which Emoji Tracker depends on, right? And this isn't a consistent developer experience because you don't expect the streaming API to be deprecated, and it's not necessarily delighting him because he's spent all this time to work on this cool side project and he's really invested in it. So an interesting thing we start seeing with APIs is that they're not necessarily permanent. Just because a company makes an API available to you now doesn't mean that it's going to be available in the future, or it might get versioned and be available in a different way. And so something to think about is how, we've talked about a little bit, but familiarity is just a more powerful concept than intuition. We want to make our software feel more intuitive, but it doesn't serve the people that already know how to use the software today. And that's why changes to these interfaces without a heads up that we're going to change this thing, we're really going to change this thing, it can feel jarring to these people. Also, I talked about delight a little bit. I think delight is a hallmark of a good user experience, and it's what engenders, love of your tool. So let's take an example. This is the shouty rooster. I don't know how many of y'all use Slack, but you'll see this if you try to do an @channel or an @everyone, and it's people in other time zones. I've been saved by this more than once. Because an @channel will send a push notification to everybody who's on your team. That's wild. So I think this is an interesting way to kind of get in front of something and try to delight the user, and also avoid your workmates maybe not liking you. I think the developer version of this is an interesting case here. This is from a company called Auth0. They do authentication and authorization for developers, and developer experience is core to their business. And so they do some really interesting and delightful things here. So when you go through and pick your development stack, they give you the option of trying out their API in Postman, which I think Amanda talked about earlier, which is a fantastic tool that you can use while you're building your APIs, because it allows you to send API requests, record API requests, so you don't have to remember what things you need in order to start making requests today. And I think that's really great. It's a good way to kind of delight your audience. Good API or a good interface is idempotent. Idempotency is one of those computer science topics that comes from math, And it's the idea that over and over again, you can do the same operation and get the same result. So how does that work here? We can imagine that we're creating a CRUD API, and it stores all your treats. And when you do a get to this particular endpoint, it should get, all of your treats. So, post to the snack endpoint, store a new record for your snacks. And this operation should reliably create snack records. And then if you delete a record, it should delete it. But then if you try to delete a deleted record, it should tell you that, it shouldn't error. It should tell you that you deleted your treat. So more than just is an API up and running, what does reliability mean? Can we create this? Are there the same kinds of objects everywhere? Are we consistent in the things we return? More than just sort of like server health. Okay, so if I decide, going back to our snack API here, if I decide to do a call to get all of the possible snacks, I'll get a certain response. So let's imagine this is a response. I'm really into hot Cheetos. I'm also into candies from New Zealand. So imagine this is in our database, the representation of our DB. But say, I want I want all the snacks for a particular user, right? And let's say this is what's returned. So that's not very consistent because it doesn't match kind of the response we get when we get all the snacks versus the endpoint for a particular user. So a better response would be this one, right? It better matches our earlier response from when we pulled from the full snack endpoint. Cool. So documentation is really important. It's so important because people when they're looking at your docs, they're already mad. So you want to have good documentation. It's the contract that you make with your user base. It lays out behavior. It's your interaction layer for an API. This is a screenshot of Stripe's API, and it's really excellent. I think it's because their primary use case is to be an API, but one of the cool things they do is this thing where they just provide a way for you to get started and go immediately because just any language you might want to use, they have it ready for you to go. So I think that's great because lowering the bar to entry is especially good because if you're already angry when you get there, how can you make it easier? How can you alleviate that? This is the Slack API documentation. And in particular, this is for the API.test method. And this is just how, when I joined Slack, how I got more familiar with the Slack API. It's one of my favorite pages because you can kind of just, put in errors or whatever. And the Slack API is interesting in a lot of ways. And one of the ways it's interesting is that it returns a top level Boolean. And we always return a 200. I know that, Amanda said don't do that, but we do that. And then we pass the error field into an error. Wow, she really didn't like that. No, that's fake. I don't know, someone's on the roof. So returning a top level OK, the reason we do that is, so you pass me on. So why do we do it? It's because the Slack API was built for us, right? It's something that we did. The API that you might have access to as the general public is also the same API that we use internally, and so we built it for our mobile and our desktop teams, and we didn't want to sort of necessarily have to worry about catching and dealing with all the errors because we, oftentimes we'll do async jobs and we'll retry things, and so it's better for us to kind of keep it moving, and error, if it's a 400, that kind of halts the interface. And so we were does it return 200 if the server is up, and it only return a 500 if the server is actually down. And I think it's interesting because oftentimes an API will demonstrate kind of the original architecture or design of something, and it's a full Conway's Law situation where a certain team built this thing and it kind of reflects them, and then a certain team built this stuff and reflects them. So pretty interesting. Okay, anyway, a decent interface is modular. And in this case, I mean a small, distinct piece of functionality that can be combined with other distinct pieces of functionality to make a whole larger interface. So let's take an actual real-world example. This is the channel membership list for the develop growth channel. This is like the main dev channel for the growth team that I'm on. And it's interesting here because this particular like sidebar is in every single channel, right? So it is modular piece, but it's comprised of some specific information, and we're going to walk through like what APIs kind of are the basis for what you see here, how we remixed them. So in order to populate the channel membership, we do a kind of a channel.info. This is like a get to this particular endpoint, and it provides us with information that we need to populate this list. So this is like an actual response at the time. And we get back the name, we get the ID, if it archived, like a bunch of information, topic, things like that. So looking at this, we can see like, okay, the name, cool, we got that back from the API. Who's the members, who's actually in the channel. But when we zoom in, we need more specific information about each individual person that's in the channel. So this is me, hi. And it shows my name, my picture, and then my presence. Am I logged into Slack or not? So we can do a call to this method, user.info, and it'll return the current state of my user, what my name is in Slack, what my avatar is, et cetera. So this is like, the JSON blob that comes back, my first name, my last name, my email, and kind of, just a huge set of avatars that are stored in S3. But it doesn't show the presence, so we need to also do a call to the get presence endpoint. And then it returns top level OK, as we talked about, and then if I'm active or not. So now if we revisit my face, we could tell like how, my presence and then like my name and stuff. That's pretty cool. So then we zoom back out to the channel list, we can tell like all the ways in which APIs have kind of, populated this list. Name, profile bits, members, presence, all that stuff. Cool. Nice. So the Slack API and the Slack UI fit together like a hand in the glove. And the reason that so many of our endpoints have like specific jobs is because, like, for instance, there's presence indicators all over the place. There are names all over the place. And you want your endpoints to kind of have a single job for a single thing. Dope. OK, so TLDR, what did I talk to you about? I'm going to tell you. Interfaces are more than just how a thing is presented. It's how it's organized. Yes, more than presentation. Cool. Yeah, I just said that. Cool. Me. Also, good interfaces are empathetic. Like they take your needs into consideration and want you to do well. And they are modular and reusable and consistent. And we should strive to make our APIs and our UIs that way. Shout outs. Lots of people made this possible, specifically Stack Engineering. And also right now, this person who is literally doing the speaker notes for me. Hi. And if you found any of these stuff interesting, find me later. Slack is hiring. Yeah, so thanks for listening.